Start our next panel, which is charting the global roadmap. We're lucky to have an extraordinary set of guests to talk about, I think, what is, from a broad perspective, maybe one of the most important issues that's occurring in the digital asset space, which is to get a sense of the extraordinary trend line of adoption that's occurring not only in terms of consumers, but also with regard to policymakers. And so we have a fantastic panel with Josh Lipskey, who is the head of the Geoeconomic Center at the Atlantic Council and probably one of the smartest observers on the adoption of digital assets, crypto, CBDCs, and the like. Lisa Cameron, who's, I jokingly referred to her the OG of crypto politics in the UK, a sitting member of the UK Parliament, now a member of the Conservative Party, and really a pioneer in UK politics and raising the flag on crypto. Paul Grewal, my boss, the chief legal officer of Coinbase, who has led our broad efforts to get regulatory clarity in the US, and a member of our executive team. And then Simon O'Brien, who's the executive director of the ADGM, the Abu Dhabi regulator, and probably also a pioneer in being one of the first major market regulators to develop a comprehensive regulatory framework around the crypto markets. So I actually want to start with Josh, just given sort of your broad remit. Can you talk about what the trend line is in terms of the global roadmap of adoption?
Happy to, and thanks so much for having me, Faryar. Thanks to Coinbase and the FT, and pleased to join this distinguished panel. So we run two projects at the Atlantic Council. One is a central bank digital currency tracking project, and one is a cryptocurrency regulatory project. And I'll come back to explain why those two intersect with each other. What we see on the cryptocurrency regulatory project, we look at the G20 plus 40 other countries that are high crypto usage countries. Of those countries, of those 60 in total, 2/3 are about to undergo major overhauls of their crypto asset regulation in a way they have not done in the past 36 months. So whatever regulation you've seen in jurisdictions, we can talk about specific countries, it's going to look very different if we convene here in 12 months than it does right now. And we look at AML-CFT, we look at taxation, we look at licensing, we look at consumer protection. What's really interesting is that on the emerging markets, only 9% of those countries cover all four bases. I think that's going to shoot up to something like 40 or 50% over the next year. So there's basically a massive regulatory overhaul happening across advanced economies and emerging markets. Now, let's think about the US for a second. What our research shows, and this will not be news to anyone in this room who is practicing in this space, the US is a global outlier. And the reason we're a global outlier is not just because we don't have a crypto asset regulatory framework or regulatory clarity. It's because we don't have a digital asset vision and a digital asset ecosystem blueprint like most countries do. If you go to other countries around the world, they think about crypto, they think about stablecoin, they think about CBDC, they think about commercial bank money, and they think about the interaction of those. They think about what they want for their economies in 5 or 10 years, and then they work a regulatory process backward from there. You might disagree with the conclusions they come to as a country, or you might agree with them, but they think about it holistically. We take very small ad hoc bites at the apple, unsuccessfully for the most part, at one piece of crypto, at one piece of stablecoin, maybe a little wholesale CBDC work, but there's no holistic vision in the United States of where we want to go, and that is holding us back. Countries want regulatory clarity from the United States. The impact of our regulatory clarity could generate enormous gains across the world. Countries are waiting. I think they're hoping post-election they're going to get something out of us, but they're not going to wait forever. So that's the bottom line of what we see right now in the global landscape.
Yeah, Josh, let me ask you a follow-up question on that. The U.S. has a uniquely fragmented regulatory system, so 2 market regulators, at least 3 bank regulators, 5 or 6 if you count it differently, state regulators, and so. Is that essentially what's happening with digital assets, a product of that fragmentation, or is there something unique about the U.S. experience?
Well, I'll make a point, and my colleague Ananya Kumar, who I work with, is here. Other countries have 6 or 7 regulators too, at different banking jurisdictions and regional banking. Yes, we have a legacy system here and regional federal reserves, but they have complicated regulatory landscapes in other jurisdictions, and they are finding a way around it. Now, we have a sort of system here in the United States where we stumble forward, as we were talking about before, and try to get to the right outcome. That's not only in digital assets, but it's particularly bad in digital assets, and I think it's particularly dangerous for our US financial leadership. So that's kind of how I see it. We sometimes rely on our fragmented regulatory framework, but we don't look at the rest of the world and say they have fragmented regulatory frameworks too, and they're finding a way in some countries, not all, but in some countries, to figure this out.
So Paul, as the Chief Legal Officer of Coinbase, your job ultimately is to take a big global company like Coinbase and navigate these waters that Josh is describing. So as a big global company, how do you think about it? What are you looking for in a particular jurisdiction as Coinbase looks to potentially enter or expand?
Well, our goal in every jurisdiction is to establish a clear enough framework for digital asset regulation that we can operate with sufficient certainty and clarity to meet market demand and market interest. And our experience has been that in different jurisdictions, we are achieving that clarity through different means. I don't think it will be much of a secret to an audience like this one that here in the United States, much of our focus to date, or at least up until very recently, has been through court litigation. But that is not really the first, second, or even third choice for Coinbase, certainly, in achieving the clarity that we think the ecosystem really needs. We are seeing progress in Congress with legislation. There's already been a bit of discussion around that, but I do think that we are starting to see a real turn with the adoption and passing of FIT 21 and progress, I will say, with respect to SAB 121, despite the veto that recently came. But in the absence of legislation or effective regulation, which of course here in the US has been in short supply, we have been forced to turn to the courts for that clarity, but it's really just been a means to an end. And in other jurisdictions, particularly in Europe, but not only Europe, we're just seeing a much more productive, orderly process for achieving clarity on each of the major issues, market structure, stable coins, sanctions, than we've ever seen up until this point in the United States. And because of that, we're quite optimistic. In fact, we're quite confident we're going to see real growth and acceleration in Europe and in other jurisdictions that adopt a much more orderly process. So for us, wherever and however we can get the clarity, we'll take it. And we're seeing real clarity emerge now in places that we never would have thought just a short while ago.
Paul, in traditional finance, consistency is critical in most aspects of financial regulation. Is it the same in the crypto markets? Do you find the different stage that different jurisdictions are in is dispositive in terms of whether we go into a market, or how do you think about that?
Well, there are certainly operational advantages that come from consistency across jurisdictions. It's just frankly a lot more efficient and a lot less capital intensive for us to comply with standards when those standards converge. But I think that one of the real unique features of crypto markets is that whether it's on topics like custody or sanctions and the like disclosures, we can adopt as necessary as different jurisdictions decide, for example, on a different regime for issuer disclosures or a different regime for data localization or custody requirements. So I do think that in a perfect world, we would have a single set of standards that we would have to comply with each and every place where we operate. But it's not essential. And for us, the main thing is for there to be a line, right? I don't particularly need to see, and we don't particularly need to see the line drawn in one particular spot on the spectrum versus another, but there has to be a line. And so I'm hopeful that we're going to see that convergence on clarity, even if the standards that are adopted may vary slightly from one jurisdiction to the next.
Simon, Abu Dhabi is a really important financial center. It's a deep, deep pool of liquidity. In many ways, you are sort of the paradigm of a large, sophisticated regulator going early in terms of developing a rule set around crypto. In fact, you're now the executive director of the ADGM, but previous, I guess in a previous earlier role, you were the person that actually developed and implemented the regulatory framework around crypto assets. As you sort of went through that journey back to 2018, looking back, what were the lessons learned? What can jurisdictions like the US and others learn from your experience?
It's a really good question. Can you hear me? No? Hello? Hello? Yep, there we go. It's a really good question, and as I was listening to Paul and Josh talk through a couple of aspects, it actually did flash me back to 2018 to really rethink why we did it in the first place. And Faryar, as you said, we have deep pools of liquidity. We have a investor focus we had to take into account. So it's been interesting watching the last 6 years, but if we go back to the first principle, regulation in the crypto space in 2018 only did a couple of things. And the first one it did was really try to shoehorn all the regulation into money services or money payments provisions and didn't look at the bit in the middle. It also didn't really look at sanctions aspects and others that Paul's touched on. So we realised without anybody else to really benchmark against, well, if we regulate the space and we get it wrong, what happens? And first of all, the investors in our part of the world would say we didn't protect the market properly. So that's why we put in those requirements around protection of the market, protection on the custody aspects, protection around the technology requirements as well, and investor protection requirements were all very, very important to put in place. We then had to be very clear on that, so we published the rules so we can self-legislate, which is a risky position for regulators to do, but we can actually enact our own legislation that set up those principles. Have we changed bits and pieces since then? Yes, we have, but fundamentally have we changed the way we look at the market? It's no, and the purpose of that regulation was to say, that looks like an exchange, it needs to be regulated like an exchange. That looks like a broker-dealer, that looks like a custodian, that looks like an issuer of a stablecoin, and certain aspects as well. It may sound simple, but what we're trying to do is match regulation and our engagement with those participants to the activity being conducted by those firms. How they did that is a bit different. So whether or not you were using a blockchain-enabled system to custodize the assets or use a different system, that's up to the firm. But the idea was then to match that. It's been very interesting watching what's happening globally because the consistency point's coming out very clearly. One of the things we've found in the years since then, it may sound exciting that regulators are publishing new legislation and rules, but there's also a risk that the last thing you want is regulators changing their rules every 6 or 12 months. Our predominant framework is the same as what it was. It will change and adapt. Stablecoins weren't being talked about in those years. The concepts of staking and yields provisions and those sorts of things weren't there at the time. The concepts of tokenizing real world assets weren't there as much as what they are now as well. So we can adapt for that. But the point was being consistent, being clear, and being able to engage with industry and realistically engage with industry, hear what they're trying to do and map it to that activity. That's been the journey we've taken every year since, and it's going to have to be the journey we continue to adopt going forward as well.
I'll ask you a kind of a loaded question, so I'll see how you sort of handle it. But as you look at other jurisdictions that are earlier in the stage and the struggle they have with the regulatory treatment of staking, for example,
Yep.
or custody local, broader localization, custody requirements, a lot of you have developed a framework that has proven effective and resilient through at least one market cycle, maybe two market cycles. Do you, given your experience, how do you think about when you see other regulators struggling with this?
Let's go through the market cycle one, and I may be in the wrong room to say that, but sometimes when you get things like 12 months ago, the crypto winter, as a regulator, that's great because that flushes out all the fly-by-nighters who sit there and say, let's go and launch a new activity in a regime, let's go and talk to the regulators. When your market is hot, regulators get swamped with authorization applications, and it's very hard to see the genuine players, those who are going to be around, and often we used to hear from some of the more established firms would say, without giving away what the pricing would be, is we still think we can operate when Bitcoin is at this level. If you look at many other models now, Bitcoin needs to be here for them to be profitable, and their business model is not necessarily sustainable. Going back to your other point, though, around legislation, when we published the legislation, when we went to our board to publish it. We also went with the second board resolution was we need the resources to do it. And we have seen many regulators in the rush to go out there just publish with no forethought about having people that can engage with crypto participants in industry and others as well, with no thought about actually building that out. And then the rules might look great. They get swamped with hundreds and hundreds of applications. They can't process it. The industry gets very unhappy with the engagement with the regulator. There's all sorts of traps in that. So we've been through a few cycles. We've seen few of the credible firms say we can survive for quite a long period of time. Their models will change. They're certainly getting more sophisticated now than what they were 5 or 6 years ago. But do we worry around some regulators just pushing legislation out? Of course we do.
You know, Lisa, when people in the digital asset space, all of us in the industry talk about crypto regulation, I find we sometimes make the mistake of focusing on the regulator and missing the fact that there needs to be a broader political endorsement or embrace of the innovation, because regulators don't operate in a vacuum. They operate subject to a political context in which they're operating. In the UK, the current government under the Prime Minister Sunak laid out a very bold vision on the adoption of tokenization and digital assets in the UK. Much of that work actually was built on a foundation you built over the years. So can you talk about kind of your approach to the politics and the lessons it may have for other jurisdictions that are still in that earlier stage of developing their political consensus around tokenization and then giving the mandate to the regulators to implement the rules?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here in the US. It's been a real privilege over the past 3 years to start the very first all-party group of cryptocurrency in the UK Parliament and to lead and chair that. Well, funnily enough, I was also the very first psychologist to be elected to the Parliament as well. So I think local people thought that our Parliament needed a psychologist. So I've had my work cut out on both tracks, really. When we started, it was really from a consumer protection angle that I arrived on the scene. One of my constituents had lost money to a scam, and he asked me who in the Parliament is doing this work. This was only, 3.5 years ago. We had a look, and there had been no debates in the House of Commons on this sector at that time. There had been very few questions to government. The legislative process hadn't really addressed this sector. And yet, when we then looked at what was happening in the UK, we realized that millions of people were already involved in the sector. If anything, actually, the population was ahead of the Parliament. So we had to play catch up. We did about 3 years of education to upskill ourselves, really tried very hard. It was a cross-party group, including members of Parliament, members of the House of Lords, to make sure that it wasn't partisan in any way. Everyone was involved, because I think that's really vital. It means that, when in a democratic process we perhaps do over time have changes of government, that the momentum persists. We may even have many more MPs elected this time, and so actually the work continues. It's very vital that we engage with the sector. I think from my learning, I realized that regulation and legislative clarity is very important for constituents. We need to represent our constituents' interests and needs from consumer protection angle, but also in terms of investment, because this industry is going to be very pivotal. Over the past 3 years, I've been learning about the digital transformation that's really taking place globally, that we want to be at the helm of that. We want to be in a leadership position, and the Prime Minister has been very clear about the UK's position, wanting to be at the helm of a cryptocurrency hub. And so all of that work has come together, and I feel that we now are able to have informed debates. We might not always agree, but we can debate the issues. We have questions to Parliament. We've had some legislation come through, and we know that this industry is not going away. this is part of a digital revolution. And actually, young people are very digitally native, so it's more vital than ever that you engage with the parliaments internationally from this sector to show the real use cases and how this can transform people's lives, economies, create jobs of the future, and financial inclusion for very many people.
So I'll ask you a hard question, because you're obviously a loyal conservative member of the parliament and very committed to the Conservative Party in the midst of the elections that are going on right now. And I know you have to be careful how you respond, but potentially there's a lot of people speculating that there'll be a shift in government. If that were to happen, do you feel like the political consensus has sufficiently established in the UK for continuity in a new government, or no?
You know, that's really been the focus of my work. As chair of the group in the Parliament, it's been very inclusive in relation to making sure that we have representation from all parties, that we have an education process from people from, you know, all parts of the Parliament, including the House of Lords, and that we make sure there is that continuity. I think this industry is too important not to lose the momentum. You know, I said that the population were way ahead. Even if I give you the example which resonates with some of the work that we did, we had the Children's Parliament come to speak to us about digital technology and transformation. They were there from age 8 to 14. You know, and then people were asking, who understands the metaverse, who understands AI, all the children put their hands up, very few MPs, even less members of the House of Lords. You know, this is a work in progress. We have a digital generation. We owe it to them to create these new jobs of the future, these careers that will be very different from when I was starting. Actually, my mum always said, be a doctor or a lawyer, never an MP. So I didn't follow the advice given. But in all honesty, I think we've come a long way. And I want to continue to work with Parliament and actually with parliaments. I'm just back from Paris and you know, learning about MiCA, and to make sure that we can support industry to get the best for our young people moving forward and for those who want to switch careers into this amazing sector.
So Josh, we're getting a lot of really good questions from the audience on the iPad that I'm having here. One of the questions, which is a really big one, but I know you'll wrangle it down to an answerable component, has to do with the fact that there's something like 4 billion people around the world that are going into election season, will have significant, potentially changes in government all around the world, including some of the most important financial markets, the European Union, UK, and the US as well. Where do you think digital assets will shake out in all of that?
Well, digital assets is high on the agenda and will stay high on the agenda. And you only have to look at the G7 leaders meeting that's happening right now in Italy. Go back a few years, the G7 leaders, not only the finance minister, let alone the leaders, would be talking about digital assets as part of the communique that they issue. You're going to see that tomorrow. Now, the issue that you raise and the question raises is half those leaders may not be there next time the G7 meets, UK, France, US. So then the question is, where does this go? I think it stays, because whatever the political leadership, as you were saying, Lisa, is, adoption's increasing. There's a realization this will be part of our economy one way or other. There is no party that can avoid dealing with it. They may have different approaches to it. So it stays high on everyone's agenda. And I think in countries that have moved forward on the regulatory framework, you're going to see further implementation of what's already done. You're not going to see backtracking. Untangling a lot of this is extraordinarily complicated. The real question mark is the US, because we've done so little. It's actually much more of a blank space here in the US. That's the jurisdiction. Here, the issuer of the world's reserve currency, the largest economy in the world, is the biggest question mark going into N24, beginning 25.
Well, Donald Trump just a week or so ago put out a pretty full-throated endorsement of crypto. So maybe it's becoming an electoral issue here.
Yeah, I mean, this is a, you know, it's a live issue in the election. You know, I never thought you'd hear things about crypto, CBDC, and an election debate, but here's where we are in this country. And let's hope that we get to a point post-election where there's a little time to breathe and there's a little time to approach sensible bipartisan policy. We've seen the beginnings of that just last month here in the US. And as I said before, everyone's waiting for that signal, but they won't wait forever.
So Paul, I love this question. I wonder if I planted it myself, but it asks about the crypto voter and the impact that he or she is having on the U.S. crypto policy. Can you talk about that?
Well, it's been remarkable. Forget about 2 or 3 years ago, 1 year ago, who would have thought that the profile of the crypto voter would actually take shape and have a real impact on real elections. We've seen that already here in the United States in several primaries. I think the shift in tone we are seeing, even in the presidential race, reflects the reality that we've now got 50+ million Americans who have owned a digital asset and over 1 million who have signed up to Stand with Crypto to serve as crypto advocates. The politicians can't ignore that. They're not ignoring that. And in an especially divided electorate, in an upcoming presidential election where the presidency could be decided in a handful of states by a few thousand votes each, even a tiny percentage of those voters who vote on crypto could make the difference. And I think we're seeing that. And I think it reflects much of what I think others on this panel have highlighted, which is a bipartisan consensus emerging globally that we need alternatives in the financial system. This isn't about displacement. This isn't about antagonism. It's about additional choice for especially young people who want to have options in their financial future. I think the shift in voting reflects that, and I think the politicians recognize that they have to pay attention to that if they want to have success in November.
Now, Lisa, there's a great question here. It asks what impact MiCA is having, what lessons it has for U.S. regulators. At the moment, there are a lot of lessons in there, but it's probably too early in the U.S. process. But I happen to have the honor of testifying in front of your all-parliamentary group on the lessons learned of MiCA for UK regulations. So you chaired an entire session on this, and I know it's been a focus of yours. So can you talk about kind of the impact of MiCA? Is MiCA essentially the global standard now, given the size of Europe? Is it informing the UK's implementation of regulation?
I think the work that we've been undertaking it's moved from educating, upskilling our parliament. Don't get me wrong, we're going to have new MPs coming. We need to continue that work. It's vital. But we've been looking at international best practice. We've been looking at what's happening in the UAE, in Asia, what's happening in the US, also in Europe. I've spent quite a bit of time in France over the past few months, quite impressed by what's happening there in relation to some of the issues that remain unresolved in the UK, such as access to bank accounts for companies, is built into the regulatory framework there. Also, the fact that they will have some grandparenting into MiCA from their regulatory framework. And I think, these are going to be global shared standards, although different jurisdictions will do different things and have different USPs. So I think it's important to be very mindful of the progress being made. I think the clarity that MiCA provides is actually, something that is showing tremendous leadership, and I've been very positive about collaborations with the EU in that regard. The UK will have its own bespoke framework, and we'll have to continue to do the work post-election to get those new MPs involved, understanding, engaged, to look at what will happen in the UK in terms of this sector and how our own regulatory framework and legislation will progress. But what I do want to make sure is that the momentum continues. And I think the work we've done with existing legislators is very important. Many of them may go into industry. Many of them will stay involved in some shape or form. And I think that dialogue will continue, and we're much more experienced and knowledgeable now about the sector, the potential it brings, and actually I feel it's a worldwide potential of financial inclusion for many communities who have been left behind, and actually that this sector has a huge amount to lend to the United Nations framework for the global goals in terms of that clear aspiration to reach those who have been left behind. So I'm very inspired by the sector, and we want to make sure collectively that we do our best to keep that momentum going in the UK and beyond.
My own take, having talked a lot to the UK government, has been there's a second mover advantage opportunity they see in terms of doing MiCA, but doing it better. I think the FCA's perspective sometimes is not so fast, but...
Yeah, well, I mean, we've been addressing some of the issues in trying to support the FCA streamline the process. They're listening to organisations who have struggled with communications, etc., and, asks from the FCA and the clarity around about that. So part of the work of the group has been feeding all of that back into government to streamline our process. And I think, I had said at the start, MiCA is coming on board, we need to be shifting ourselves ahead, and I was reminded that the UK likes to have a second mover advantage, and that can be a positive thing, and I think, it will come out in the wash eventually.
Simon, I'm going to ask you the last question. There's a good question here about kind of the emerging markets and their approach to regulation, and I guess the way I think about it is emerging markets often have to think about crypto heavily from a retail market lens, whereas more sophisticated or more developed markets like yours, Singapore probably being kind of an extreme example, think about it much more from an institutional perspective. Those of us in the industry, we have an institutional audience here, but I know as Coinbase, we think about it as a complementary ecosystem that you need to have, just like in traditional markets, you need to have a mix of institutional and retail. How do you think about it? What do you see in emerging economies, and how do you think about that retail institutional mix?
It's such a good question, and most of the jurisdictions, when they get exposed to it first, it comes through the retail lens first. And one of the real interesting part of the aspects of that is how a client gets onboarded. So that concept that we see in a genuine institutional market is that concept of a member or broker being the intermediary before the client connects to the market and trades. So the crypto world started with that, but now, going back to your point, it's starting to reverse back. If you look through, do the institutions want to hold their assets in the custodian so they can trade real time? The answer in the conventional world is no. The answer up till now in the crypto world has been, well, that's how it works. But going forward, we suspect that's going to have to change substantively. And so what it means is the model of an exchange or a broker will probably start to fragment a bit between, here is the retail offering, if you look at Coinbase and Coinbase Prime and those aspects across the world. That's what we're going to have to deal with as a regulator. So the point of access to facilitate a retail market for payments and remittance and distribution is going to be very different to an institutional market that will want to trade spot and derivatives, settle T plus something, not immediately, though there may be facilitation for that. I think that's going to be a real key driver for the institutional adoption into the market, because that will then in some ways have the crypto market then conform a little bit more than what's happened previously to this is what the institutions want. And I think as a regulator we have to facilitate both. We have to protect both retail and institutional. Does it keep us up at night into how we manage that? And that flows then into leverage and margin. What leverage position do you manage for a retail client compared to institutional client? The concept of automatic closeout and liquidation in a market for a retail client is different institutional market as well. They're fascinating concepts. Do we have the answers now? No. But at least in Abu Dhabi, we're trying to get the right firms to work from. So we don't want 500 firms doing that. We probably want a handful that can provide a market for institutional and retail participants. And the secret for us as a regulator is then learning from the firms who will say, this is how we think we can do it, rather than us saying, this is how you're going to have to do it. But we're going to have to work on that. It's very exciting, though.
Yeah, there's so much. It was a great panel. So much that we could be covering, but just given the limitations of time, I want to thank all of you for participating, and thank you for all of us for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you so much.